Veterans saw a poor single mom returning her daughter's milk. What he did next shocked everyone. The line at Megamart crawled forward beneath buzzing fluorescent lamps. The shelves gleamed with abundance, but Eleanor Vance could only feel scarcity pressing on her chest. Her worn wallet was thin, the bills crumpled and few. In the cart lay a single treasure, an infant formula her little girl Daisy desperately needed. When the cashier announced the total, Eleanor's hands shook. She counted the bills twice, then a third time, as if sheer will could stretch the numbers. It wasn't enough. The line behind her grew impatient, voices murmuring, eyes pricking at her back. Her throat tightened. With trembling fingers, she lifted the formula and pushed it back across the counter. I can't take this today." Her voice was a whisper, almost drowned by the beep of the scanner. Daisy stirred in her stroller, small hands reaching toward the carton as though sensing the loss. Eleanor bent low, kissing her child's forehead. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," she whispered, the words splintering her heart. From 2 places back in line, James Caldwell saw everything. Broad-shouldered, weathered by years of service as a Special Forces operator, he was used to witnessing hardship. But this pierced deeper. The way Eleanor's eyes glistened with shame, the way her shoulders hunched against invisible blows, the way she tried to hide her pain from the world. The cashier bagged her few other items, discount bread, a handful of vegetables, and Eleanor moved quickly, head bowed, toward the exit. James remained still, his hand tightening on the apple juice bottle his daughter Sophia had begged for. His own life hadn't been easy since his wife's death, but he knew the look of a soldier under fire. Eleanor Vance wasn't fighting bullets. She was fighting poverty, loneliness, and the cruel indifference of a city that kept moving while she drowned. And in that instant, James knew he couldn't let her fight alone. What he did next would not only change Eleanor's life, it would awaken a bond tied to a battlefield decades past. Eleanor Vance lived in the margins of the city, where the neon lights dimmed and the bus routes thinned into long waits at cold metal benches. At 27, her face still held traces of youth, but hardship had carved shadows beneath her eyes. She worked nights cleaning offices, her hands raw from chemicals, and mornings at a diner where tips barely stretched past rent and utilities. The formula she couldn't afford that night was not a luxury. It was prescribed, a special brand Daisy needed because her little stomach rejected anything else. Her apartment was 1 flight above a laundromat, the walls thin, the air smelling faintly of detergent and fried oil. She loved Daisy with the fierce devotion only desperation could forge, but every day was a balancing act, choosing between groceries and medicine, bills and bus fare. Her late father had been a machinist at the shipyard, her mother a seamstress, both gone before Daisy was born. She was alone, tethered to survival by nothing more than stubborn love. James Caldwell lived in another world entirely, yet not one of wealth. His workshop sat at the edge of town, a squat garage with peeling paint but engines that purred under his touch. Once, he had commanded men in places most Americans couldn't pronounce, parachuting into jungles and deserts, leading missions that never made the news. After 20 years of service, the uniform was gone, but the discipline and the scars remained. Widowed at 38, he raised Sophia alone. The girl was 8 now, curious and bright, with her mother's eyes and his stubborn chin. She spent weekends at the garage, her homework spread on the hood of a car while James worked. The rhythm of fatherhood and grease-stained labor had become his battlefield of healing. The paychecks were modest, the hours long, but James believed in fixing things. Cars, lives, broken spirits. The two worlds, Eleanor's fragile survival and James's quiet rebuilding, might never have collided if not for that night in the supermarket. James had gone there reluctantly, Sophia tugging his hand, insisting on the brand of apple juice she'd seen on television. He had smiled, indulging her. It was such a small request, and after years of deployments that had stolen birthdays and holidays, he tried to say yes whenever he could. When Eleanor stepped into his line of sight, clutching the formula with trembling hands, James recognized something instantly. It was the look of a soldier cornered with no way out, exhaustion masked as composure, shame disguised as silence. He had seen it on battlefields, in comrades' eyes when supplies ran dry, in the mirror when grief consumed him after his wife's death. Sophia, too young to understand, tugged at his sleeve. "Daddy, why is that lady sad?" she whispered. James squeezed her hand, but said nothing, his gaze following Eleanor out of the store. That was the setting. A weary mother, a hardened veteran, two children whose innocence deserved better, and a city that would have let them pass each other without a second glance. But fate had drawn a thin, invisible line between them, one that reached back decades to a battlefield in Vietnam, a bond neither yet knew they shared. The night air was sharp, tinged with the metallic scent of rain on pavement. Eleanor sat on the cold bench at the bus stop, Daisy's stroller tucked close, her small daughter already dozing under a thin blanket. The neon glow from the Mega Mart sign flickered, casting her in alternating bands of light and shadow. She kept her gaze low, hoping the few passers-by wouldn't notice the redness in her eyes. Clutched in her lap was a paper bag of the cheapest groceries she could afford, bread, rice, a handful of canned beans. Her heart ached with the absence of the formula. Each breath felt like failure. Headlights approached. The familiar rattle of an old pickup slowed, then stopped beside the bench. Eleanor stiffened. The driver's side door opened, and out stepped the man she had seen in line at the store, the broad-shouldered stranger with weary eyes. He carried a bag. "Excuse me," he said gently, his voice low enough not to wake Daisy. "You forgot something." Eleanor frowned. No, I didn't." He held out the bag. Inside, she glimpsed the formula can, a roasted chicken, a loaf of fresh bread, apples, and a box of cookies. Warmth and aroma spilled into the night air. Her cheeks burned. "I can't accept this." "You can," he said, his gaze steady but kind. "And you should. This isn't charity. It's one parent looking out for another." "I don't need pity." Her voice wavered, caught between pride and desperation. "This isn't pity," he answered softly. "It's a gift from one soldier's family to another's." He hesitated, as if the words had escaped too soon, then steadied himself. "I know what it is to raise a child alone, to worry about every meal, every bill. Please, take it for her sake, not yours." Eleanor's eyes stung. She looked down at Daisy, whose tiny fists twitched in sleep. The scent of the warm chicken twisted in her stomach. Her pride screamed to refuse, but her love for her daughter pressed harder. With trembling hands, she accepted the bag. "Thank you," she whispered, voice breaking. He smiled faintly, relief softening his rugged face. "Name's James Caldwell. I own a garage down on Pine Street, and that's my old truck over there. Let me drive you home? It's too cold for a bus tonight." Every instinct told Eleanor to refuse. Strangers and kindness were luxuries she hadn't trusted in years. Yet something in his tone, steady, respectful, not demanding, made her pause. She studied him, the worn lines around his eyes, the sincerity etched into his stance. "All right," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "Just this once." James nodded and opened the truck door, careful as though he were handling something sacred. He lifted Daisy's stroller with the same quiet reverence. As the pickup pulled away from the curb, the silence inside wasn't awkward. Eleanor watched the rearview mirror, where Daisy's reflection slept peacefully, and then glanced sideways at James. His hand gripped the wheel, his jaw set in concentration, but there was a softness in his gaze whenever he glanced at his own daughter's car seat, empty for now, but still strapped securely in the back. In that silence, Eleanor felt it, the faint, fragile thread of trust weaving itself between two strangers. It was the first connection, born not of chance, but of shared burdens only parents and survivors could understand. The drive to Eleanor's neighborhood was short, but the silence between them carried the weight of unspoken histories. James kept his eyes on the road, the hum of the old pickup filling the space. He could sense Eleanor's guardedness, the way her hands clutched the grocery bag as if it were both a shield and a lifeline. He didn't push. He knew what it meant to hold walls up. When they reached her apartment, she thanked him quietly, lifting Daisy into her arms. James nodded, tipped his head in farewell, and drove off. But long after he left, her eyes followed the truck's taillights fading into the night. That night, Eleanor lay awake in her small apartment. The radiator hissed unevenly. The ceiling bore stains of water damage, but Daisy slept soundly against her chest. Eleanor stared at the shadows and thought about the stranger who had seen her humiliation and answered it not with judgment, but with compassion. She wondered what kind of man still believed in kindness in a world that had taught her to expect the opposite. For James, the night unraveled differently. He parked outside his garage, the smell of oil and grease mingling with the faint scent of roasted chicken that lingered in the cab. He closed his eyes and saw her face, not just the exhaustion, but the pride that had nearly stopped her from accepting help. Pride he recognized because he had carried it himself after returning home from war. Memories surged, the desert sun beating down on armored convoys, the echo of gunfire in abandoned villages, the sight of his brothers in arms collapsing beside him, and then the nights after discharge, when he would sit alone in an empty kitchen, staring at the refrigerator stocked with food he couldn't bring himself to eat because his wife's chair was empty. When cancer had taken her, it had left a hole no battle scar could rival. Raising Sophia alone became his new deployment, one that demanded more of his heart than any mission had asked of his body. And yet, there had been light too. He remembered his grandfather, Corporal Thomas Caldwell, who had raised him after his parents died young. A man who carried stories of Vietnam with a reverence that bordered on prayer. He often spoke of a comrade named Sergeant Michael Vance, a soldier who had dragged him out of the chaos of Khe Sanh, saving his life when enemy fire threatened to cut them both down. If not for him, his grandfather would say, you and I wouldn't even be here, James. Never forget that debt. James never did. So when curiosity pressed him about Eleanor, he quietly reached out through his network of veterans. A friend at the VA center confirmed her last name, Vance. His pulse quickened. Could it be? He searched deeper, uncovering fragments of records, faded photographs, and finally, confirmation. Eleanor was Sergeant Michael Vance's great-granddaughter. The discovery shook him. The girl he had seen at the checkout line, forced to return her daughter's milk, carried the bloodline of the man who had given his grandfather, and by extension, his entire family, a future. It was more than coincidence. It was a thread pulled tight across generations, stretching from a jungle battlefield in 1968 to a dimly lit supermarket in the present day. James sat in his workshop that night, staring at an old cigar box where he kept his grandfather's medals and letters. Among them was one piece he had read countless times, a scrawled note from Thomas Caldwell to his family, written after Khe-Sanh. If I live to grow old, it will be because of Mike Vance. My debt is unpayable. My hope is that one day our families will meet and we will honor each other not with medals, but with kindness. James closed the lid, his chest tight. That day had come, though neither man had lived to see it. The debt still remained, waiting to be honored, and James knew, with a clarity that felt like destiny, that simply handing Eleanor money or gifts would never suffice. To honor Sergeant Vance meant more than charity. It meant building something lasting, something that would lift her up without wounding her dignity. It meant carrying the torch his grandfather had passed to him, just as Vance had carried him through gunfire all those years ago. The days after their supermarket encounter unfolded quietly, but something had shifted. Eleanor rose earlier for her shifts at the diner, her steps heavy, but her resolve firm. Each time she opened the cupboard and saw the can of formula James had given her, she felt both gratitude and discomfort. Gratitude because Daisy was fed, discomfort because she hated owing anyone, least of all a stranger. She began searching for better work. Between shifts, she circled job postings in the classifieds and checked the bulletin boards at the community center. Most places wanted qualifications she didn't have. Still, she refused to give up. Daisy deserved more than hand-me-down hope. James, meanwhile, carried Eleanor's face with him like a weight he could not put down. In the garage, as he tightened bolts and changed oil, he replayed the moment she pushed the formula across the counter, whispering an apology that no mother should ever have to make. And always he heard his grandfather's voice, "If I live to grow old, it will be because of Mike Vance. My debt is unpayable." That night, James sat at his kitchen table with a notebook and a pen. He made lists, possible donors, veterans he still kept in touch with, local businesses with patriotic leanings. He wasn't a rich man, but he had something more valuable than wealth, a network of soldiers and civilians who still believed in honor. The idea grew quickly, a scholarship, not just for Eleanor, but for any descendant of veterans who had sacrificed for their country, a living memorial to men like Sergeant Michael Vance. James decided to name it the Vance Legacy Scholarship, but first, he would fund it himself. He withdrew a portion of the life insurance settlement from his late wife, a sum he had guarded carefully for Sophia's future. He told himself it wasn't charity, it was repayment, a promise kept across 50 years. To stretch the fund further, he took on extra shifts, staying late in the garage, fixing cars long after Sophia had gone to bed. Exhaustion tugged at him, but purpose kept him steady. Every spark of the welder, every clink of a socket wrench felt like striking iron for something larger than himself. Meanwhile, Eleanor found herself drawn to the local Veterans Center. She had noticed a flyer taped to a bus stop. Hiring, community outreach assistant. Support veterans and families. Training provided. The pay wasn't much, but the work resonated. She applied, and for the first time in years, she felt a flicker of possibility when the director called her in for an interview. She told Daisy about it that night as she rocked her to sleep. "If I get this job, sweetheart, maybe we'll be okay. Maybe we'll finally belong somewhere." She didn't know that her story had already begun weaving into the very heart of that center. A month later, the board of the Veterans Center announced the launch of a new scholarship, the Vance Legacy Fund. It promised monthly stipends, full coverage of educational expenses, and additional support for childcare. The first recipient would be chosen discreetly, based on need. Eleanor never imagined her name would be called. When the letter arrived in the mail, an official envelope stamped with the center's seal, her hands shook so hard she nearly dropped it. "Congratulations," it read. "You have been selected as the inaugural recipient of the Vance Legacy Scholarship." Tears blurred the words. She clutched Daisy to her chest, her heart pounding with relief. For the first time, the future no longer looked like a dark tunnel with no exit. It looked like a road opening wide, lit by something she couldn't explain. And somewhere across town, James folded his hands over the notebook where he had written in block letters, "Debt paid, promise kept." But he knew it wasn't over. One day, Eleanor would learn the truth, that the scholarship was not just a stroke of fortune, but a gift rooted in a battlefield debt older than both of them. And when that moment came, he prayed she would understand. The auditorium of the Veterans Center was filled with rows of folding chairs, the air thick with the smell of fresh coffee and polished wood. It was the annual appreciation ceremony, but this year carried special weight: the official launch of the Vance Legacy Scholarship. Eleanor sat nervously in the front row, Daisy perched on her lap in a yellow dress borrowed from a neighbor. Her palms were clammy, her heart fluttering as the director of the center spoke about honoring sacrifices of the past to secure futures for the next generation. She barely heard the words. Her mind spun with disbelief that she was even here. When her name was called, applause swelled. Eleanor rose, holding Daisy's hand, and walked onto the stage. The spotlight blinded her for a moment, but when she reached the podium, she steadied herself. "I never imagined my daughter and I would be given such a chance," she began, her voice trembling. "This scholarship isn't just money, it's hope. And hope is something I haven't had for a long time." The audience was silent, hanging on her words. She swallowed hard, her eyes blurring. "I promise I'll use this opportunity to build a better life for Daisy. Thank you, from the bottom of my heart." Thunderous applause filled the hall. Eleanor turned to leave the stage and froze. James Caldwell was stepping forward, a folder tucked under his arm, his expression solemn yet resolute. She hadn't seen him since the night at the supermarket. Recognition flared in her chest. Shock, then confusion. Why was he here? The director handed him the microphone. And now, the man who made this scholarship possible, Mr. James Caldwell. Gasps rippled through the room. Eleanor's heart stopped. She clutched Daisy tighter, the world spinning. James cleared his throat. His voice carried the weight of both confession and honor. "This fund was born from a story older than myself. 55 years ago, during the siege of Khe Sanh, My grandfather, Corporal Thomas Caldwell, was wounded and pinned down. He would not have survived if not for a man named Sergeant Michael Vance. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Eleanor's knees weakened. Her grandfather's name, spoken aloud, reverently, rang in her ears. Sergeant Vance carried my grandfather through enemy fire 2 miles until he reached safety. My family exists today because of him. For decades, my grandfather carried the weight of that debt. He wrote that one day our family should meet, not with medals or money, but with kindness. James's gaze swept the crowd, then found Eleanor's. His voice softened. When I saw Eleanor Vance that night in the supermarket, I didn't see a stranger. I saw the granddaughter of the man who saved my bloodline. I knew it was time to honor that promise. The room was silent, thick with emotion. Eleanor's tears spilled freely, her pride and shame dissolving into something greater. Understanding. The scholarship wasn't charity. It was legacy. It was her grandfather's sacrifice echoing forward, lifting her and Daisy when they needed it most. James reached into the folder and withdrew a faded letter, its paper yellowed with age. This was written by my grandfather after Kay San. He wanted your family to know I lived because of Mike Vance. Whatever I build, whatever my children or grandchildren achieve, will always belong partly to him. He placed the letter on the podium, then stepped back, his eyes never leaving Eleanor's. The audience erupted in applause, but for Eleanor, the sound receded into a blur. She saw only James, this man who had carried forward a promise across generations, who had honored her grandfather not with pity, but with dignity. Clutching Daisy, she walked across the stage, her tears falling freely. And when she reached James, she whispered the only words that mattered. "You paid a debt that never had to be paid. Thank you." James shook his head gently. "No, Eleanor, it always had to be paid." The hall rose to its feet in a standing ovation, but neither of them heard it. In that moment, beneath the bright lights and the gaze of 100 witnesses, they stood not as strangers, but as two families finally bound together by honor fulfilled. The celebration carried through the evening, but not everyone in the hall was clapping. From her seat near the back, Patricia Harding watched with a tight smile that never reached her eyes. Wife of a retired colonel and longtime member of the Veterans Center Board, Patricia was known for her sharp tongue and sharper suspicions. In the days that followed, whispers began to spread. At a board meeting, Patricia leaned forward, her pearls catching the fluorescent light. "While I commend Mr. Caldwell's sentiment," she said coolly, "I have concerns. It seems rather convenient, don't you think? A mechanic funds a scholarship, and the very first recipient is a young single mother he's taken an interest in. One has to wonder whether this is charity or favoritism." The room stiffened. Eleanor, seated as a guest to report on how the scholarship had changed her life, felt heat rise to her cheeks. She opened her mouth to speak, but James raised a hand gently, signaling her to stay calm. He rose from his chair, the weight of his presence enough to command silence. "Mrs. Harding," he said evenly, "you're right about one thing. This isn't ordinary charity. It's a promise kept." He laid a folder on the table, opening it with deliberate care. Inside were photocopies of his grandfather's service records, maps of Kay San, and sworn testimonies from surviving veterans. These documents confirm Sergeant Michael Vance saved my grandfather's life in 1968. Without him, I wouldn't be here. Eleanor wouldn't be here. Her daughter Daisy wouldn't be here. This scholarship isn't favoritism. It's a 50-year-old debt finally being honored. Patricia's face paled, but James didn't stop there. He drew out the faded letter his grandfather had written, the same one he had shared at the ceremony. He read aloud the final lines. "If I live to grow old, it will be because of Mike Vance. May our families one day meet in kindness, and may my children always remember they owe him their lives." When he finished, the room was silent. One by one, board members nodded, some even wiping tears from their eyes. The director cleared his throat. "That seems more than clear, Mrs. Harding. The Vance Legacy Scholarship stands." Patricia shifted uncomfortably, her authority slipping through her fingers. She muttered something about misunderstandings and sat down, her gaze fixed on the polished table. Eleanor felt her breath release in a rush she hadn't realized she was holding. James returned to his seat beside her, his hand brushing hers under the table, not a gesture of romance, but of solidarity. The meeting adjourned, and as they stepped into the crisp evening air, Eleanor turned to him. "You didn't just defend me," she whispered. "You defended my grandfather, my family." James looked at her, his eyes steady, carrying both grief and pride. "No," he said quietly, "I defended the truth, and the truth will always silence doubt." 2 years slipped by like pages in a well-worn book. The scholarship Eleanor once held as a lifeline had become her springboard. She completed her degree in nonprofit management, nights of exhaustion transformed into mornings of triumph. At the graduation ceremony, Daisy sat in the front row beside Sophia, both girls waving handmade signs that read, "Go Mom," in crooked crayon letters. James was there too. He stood tall in the crowd, clapping until his palms stung, his eyes bright with pride. To him, Eleanor's achievement was more than personal success. It was the fulfillment of a promise stretching back to Kay San, a promise kept alive through her determination. Not long after, James invited Eleanor to join him at the Veterans Center. She accepted, stepping into a role that gave her the power to expand the Vance Legacy Scholarship and shape it into a program serving hundreds of families. Side by side, she and James became a team. He brought the grit of a soldier and the steadiness of a mechanic. She brought vision and compassion honed by hardship. Together, they built something lasting. But it wasn't only work that bound them. Evenings often ended with family dinners, Daisy and Sophia giggling over spilled juice, Eleanor setting plates on the table while James told stories that made the girls laugh and roll their eyes. What had begun with a quiet act of kindness in a supermarket now unfolded into the steady rhythm of a shared life. On a warm spring afternoon, they gathered at the park near the Veterans Memorial. James and Eleanor sat together on a bench, their shoulders brushing, watching Daisy and Sophia chase one another through the grass. The sound of their laughter mingled with birdsong, rising into the air like a hymn of renewal. Eleanor leaned her head against James's shoulder. "If my grandfather could see this," she murmured, "I think he'd finally believe his sacrifice meant something more than war." James's eyes softened as he watched the girls. He'd see that his courage still lives, in you, in Daisy, in all of this. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the sun casting golden light across the memorial stones. Generations of names were etched there, reminders of lives cut short, debts never forgotten. And yet, In the laughter of their daughters and the bond between them, those names found new meaning. The legacy of Sergeant Michael Vance was not just in medals or battlefield valor. It lived here, at a picnic bench in a quiet park, in the love between two families who had once been strangers, and in the hope of children running free. The story ended not with war, but with peace, not with debt, but with honor fulfilled. And it all began with a mother returning a can of milk and a veteran who refused to let her walk away empty-handed.